It's a special Fan Friday edition of the LockedOn Giants podcast. Joining me for the first time on the program is none other than the gentleman known as the Entertainah. You will find out more coming up next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. Patricia Traina here with you. And thank you so much for making us your first listen, or if you're watching on YouTube, your first watch of the day. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, you probably recognize this gentleman that I have on screen with me. He is known as the Entertainah. I hope I did that right. AKA his real name is Chris, and he is here. And we're doing something a little different because I like to, every once in a while, have the voice of the fans come on the show, because without you guys and gals, there is no Locked On Giants. There is no Giants Country. There is no Patricia Traina. And it's always good also to hear the perspectives of the fans, from the fans, because sometimes you guys have different perspectives and better perspectives than those of us in the media. So here we are. Chris is here with us. And Chris, thank you, first off, for taking the time to join me.
No, thank you for having me on. Yeah, I think you do a great job. And when you reached out and you said you wanted to do something, I was excited. And it's the bye week, so we got a lot to talk about. Recap the first half of the season, maybe talk about what's coming ahead. But thank you so much for having me on. Looking forward to talking Giants football.
Yeah, let's do it. All right. So, yes, as we record this, folks, we are in the bye week. And it's been an interesting start to the season. And Chris, let me get your perspective on the season, what you have seen. I mean, what I've seen is like a stop and go type of thing with this team. They give you a reason to be down on them, and then they give you a reason to be up and then down. And it's kind of been like a yo-yo. What have you seen from them?
Typical, right? I mean, that's what we're used to with this team, especially early in the season. We always seem to get off the slow starts. I think we usually start around 2-6. We're 3-6 right now, but recently they've shown, like you said, some hope. There's been a little bit of a yo-yo effect where they've had some ups and downs. There's been a ton of injuries. We always have a lot of injuries, but this year in particular, I feel like we've had even more. After we lost Andrew Thomas, that obviously had a huge effect on the offensive line. Barkley hurt again. Galladay hurt, and now he's back, but he's been hurt. Tony's even missed some time. Everybody's missed some time on the offense. They lost 2 starting offensive linemen before the year started. And Blake Martinez went down. So the one thing I'll say, the last couple of weeks, I feel like the defense is starting to click. And I was tough on Patrick the first 3 or 4 weeks. I felt like he wasn't coming out with that good of a game plan. I thought his game plan against the Chiefs was masterful. I thought he came out with a beautiful game plan in that game, and he definitely outcoached Andy Reid. And this past week, I thought the defense looked very good as well. So I think that's an optimistic standpoint. And when you look ahead at our schedule, if we could start to get healthy, which is a huge if, after this Bucs game, there's a lot of winnable games. I mean, we play the Eagles twice. You play Washington. You play Miami, who doesn't look that good. You play Chicago with a rookie quarterback. So I think there's opportunities there if the Giants could ever beat the Bucs to win 8 or 9 games. But obviously going to be a really tough game coming out of the bye.
Yeah, but they came close last year to beating the Bucs. I mean, again, self-inflicted wounds by this team, probably the biggest culprit and the most frustrating. That's why you have that start and stop effect, that yo-yo effect. Let me ask you about Joe Judge. What has been your impressions on Joe Judge through this first year and a half of his tenure?
I think most Giant fans, myself included, when Judge first took the job and we heard the opening press conference, we were all really excited about it. He seemed like a guy that was going to bring structure, a guy that could be the long-term answer here. Last year was kind of a mess, right? Because of the pandemic, there was no preseason. So I thought Judge handled it pretty well. I mean, were there some questionable decisions from within the season? Sure. Maybe he rushed Daniel Jones back a week earlier than he should have. The musical chairs with the offensive linemen, that was a little questionable, at least in my opinion, shuffling guys in and out. But overall, I thought Judge had a really good rookie year and showed a lot of promise coming into this season. This year, seems like the fan base is taking a complete 180 on him. And in some instances, I think rightfully so. His mismanagement of the timeouts. I know he used the headset as an excuse for that, but I don't know, man. I feel like, he said it's happening every week. Like you would think you'd have a contingency plan at some point. So I didn't really look at that as that could have been an excuse in terms of his timeout usage. And I don't know. I think there's times where Judge, I feel, is too conservative, at times. So overall, I'm not a guy that's going to come on here and say that I want Joe Judge fired, like a lot of fans have said just a year and a half into his tenure. I think that's been a major problem with the Giants organization over the last 5, 6, 7 years, is they've had no continuity, whether it be the head coach, whether it be the offensive line. So I'm a guy that wants to give Joe Judge another year or two to try to figure this out, but he's definitely had some hiccups in his second year.
For sure. And, you could add in the hiccups, special teams, 12 penalties.
And that's what we're supposed to be the best at.
I know. And that leads the league, 12 penalties for 105 yards. I mean, that just perplexed me. And I had to ask him about it this week. And I did on the Monday presser that we did. And he gave me a good answer, explaining what's important and what to look for. But even he said the penalties have got to stop. I mean, I just don't get it.
I looked at the penalties before this week, and they actually did much better this past week. They didn't commit a penalty in the whole second half of the game. They committed 4 penalties in the first half. But I looked at their penalties. They have more, I believe, roughing the passer penalties already this year than they had all of last year. So that in a half a season. So that's something also for a guy that talks about having his team prepared, not making silly mistakes. It doesn't look good on Joe Judge. It just doesn't.
Well, you're right. The discipline penalties, like the taunting and stuff like that. And that's something I wondered about, because I'm like, we see in training camp when the practices are open to the media, we get to see the whole practice. Okay, now you go on a penalty lap, or your coach goes on a penalty lap. And now we're in season. We don't get to see the whole practices. So I'm wondering what's being done. Do they actually still have the time to have guys run laps if they screw up? I mean, I just wondered about that because it's gotten sloppy.
Yeah, I'm with you. And that's something they got to clean up. The Giants, I say this all the time, the Giants, how I realized that the Giants are not a very good team, even though I love them and I root for them each and every week, we are not good enough to overcome mistakes.
Yes.
And last year, we didn't make a lot of mistakes. We didn't turn the ball over a whole lot. We didn't commit a lot of penalties. And I think that's why we were pretty competitive in most of our games last year, even though we were not near as talented as a lot of the teams we were going up against. But like you said, we played the Bucs last year, played them really close, had no business playing them close, played the Rams close, had no business playing them close, beat the Seahawks. So this year, I just feel like a lot of times, like you were saying earlier, we beat ourselves. I mean, if we're being honest with ourselves, and I hate to say that we should be, but we really should. We should have beaten Washington. I think that's obvious. And we should have beaten the Chiefs. And we easily could have beaten the Falcons. Yeah, so I think a lot of it goes back to the fact that we've beaten ourselves. Whether it be stupid penalties or whatever it may be. And we can't afford to do that as a football team.
The good thing about it, though, if there is a silver lining, Joe hasn't lost his team like McAdoo did when he was here, like when Shermer started to, the players remain bought in, I should say. Joe doesn't throw anybody under the bus, which is good. There's constant communication. So that part he's got. And you could still see that the players are playing hard for him. You don't see anybody mailing it in after a while saying, gosh, we're 3-6. Our playoff chances are down. Let's just, get through the season and get our paycheck and go home.
Yeah, I forgot what game it was. I think it was against the Rams where I started to feel like they mailed it in the last 7 or 8 minutes of that game. But then the next week they came out with a great effort. And you're absolutely right. Under Ben McAdoo, people always like defend Ben McAdoo and they're like, oh, well, Ben McAdoo wanted Pat Mahomes. How bad of a coach could he have been? He made the playoffs his first year with the New York Giants. They won 11-5, even though I always say that I think it was due in large part to the fact that they spent like lunatics in free agency. That certainly helped. I contest that if Tom Coughlin was the coach on that team, they may have won the Super Bowl that year. That's just my honest opinion on it. But as far as McAdoo goes, the team, you're absolutely right. And it was one of the most embarrassing moments for me as a Giants fan that year when that team just completely mailed it in the last 3-4 weeks of the season. And obviously his handling of Eli Manning didn't help.
No, it didn't. That was a big turning point and an ugly stain on the history of the team, especially these last 10 years where the football has been fruitless. So let me now turn to another topic. And for those of you just tuning in at this point on YouTube, I'm speaking with Chris, who is better known as the Entertainah. He has a channel. He covers all kinds of sports. He gives a fan's perspective. And that's what we're doing here. We're trying to reach out to some of the fans. And Chris was kind enough to come on with me. So I'm excited. First time I'm talking with this gentleman. And so far it's been a blast. Chris, let me ask you about Daniel Jones.
Yeah.
This guy is, I've seen the fan base divided before.
Mm-hmm.
This is the latest division I think I've seen, because you've got some people who think Daniel is the answer. Excuse me. You've got some who don't think he's the answer, and you've got some who don't think they know yet that we don't have an answer as to whether or not he's the guy. Where do you stand on Daniel Jones?
I'm in the middle, like you just said. I don't think, first off, the New York Giants completely set him up for failure. Whether you're the biggest Daniel Jones hater or the Daniel Jones lover, that's obvious. No offensive line. They didn't really get him sufficient weapons until this year, and they've been hurt. And they put him through 2 different schemes in his first 2 years in the NFL. Like, it's as bad of a start. And I thought they rushed him in his rookie year personally. I thought they should have left Eli Manning in there for at least another 4 or 5 weeks. Otherwise, what was the point of having Eli Manning on the team? He could have sat and learned and been more comfortable when he came in. So I think the Giants have just botched the whole Daniel Jones upbringing and stability with their quarterback. And I don't think they could have handled it much worse than what they have. But that being said, I frequently get asked this question when I'm live on my channel. Is Daniel Jones a franchise quarterback? There's no way I could say that right now. And I want to. I love Daniel Jones. I think he has a great work ethic. I was very against the pick when the Giants made it. I've since come around and really want to give the kid an opportunity. But in today's NFL, Pat, when quarterbacks get paid the amount of money they do on a second salary, we saw what Pat Mahomes got paid. We saw what Dak Prescott got paid. How can you say that's what a franchise quarterback is to me? A guy that could eat up 15% of the salary cap and still maintain a very good roster. And up to this point, even though I do think Daniel Jones, if he's put in the right situation, if Jones is on the Saints, I think he's a damn good quarterback. If he's on the Browns, I think he's a damn good quarterback. But with the Giants, up until this point, he has not proven that he could carry the football team, even though he has not been provided with the best of situations. So it's impossible for me to say right now that he's a franchise guy. But at the same time, I haven't quite given up on him yet either.
Yeah, I haven't either. And I think that's why the Giants are going to not only pick up his option year next year at the deadline, they're going to stick with him for another couple of years, because see what you got with him, stabilize that offensive line, keep him in the same offensive system for more than 2 years, don't stop flipping stuff around and get him better weapons. I mean, because look, they got him good weapons this year. Don't get me wrong. Kenny Golladay, when healthy, great weapon.
Yeah.
Kadarius Toney, when healthy, I'm really excited by that kid.
Looks good.
I do think, though, they're going to switch out tight ends, because I don't know that Evan Ingram will be back next year. I do not think if Sterling Shepard is going to be back next year because of the cap hit. And I question if Darius Slayton is going to be on this roster. So I could see them potentially maybe redoing some of those skill makers. And I haven't spoken about Saquon Barkley yet. We'll get to him in just a moment. But, for Daniel, I agree with you spot on. And I've been saying this, you look at Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, when those guys came in, they were set up with good offensive lines.
Couldn't have been set up better.
Running game. I mean, I never understood
you look at Pat Mahomes, and don't get me wrong, Pat Mahomes is a more talented quarterback than Daniel Jones. I'll be the first to say it. But you look at Pat Mahomes. Pat Mahomes sat for a year under probably the smartest quarterback in the NFL with Alex Smith. High IQ guy, learned for a year, and he's got the most brilliant offensive mind in football in Andy Reid. Daniel Jones, he has Jason Garrett, and he got thrown into the fire 2 weeks in with no offensive line, and you got rid of Pat Shurmur, which, by the way, and I know you're asking me questions, I want to get your opinion on that. I got ridiculed with about 4 weeks to go in Pat Shurmur's final season. I thought they should have stuck with Pat for another year, because Pat was the guy that I thought was responsible for drafting Daniel Jones, and you drafted Daniel Jones to play in Pat Shurmur's scheme. When you moved on and I don't think Shurmur was a great head coach, but when you moved on from Shurmur, we're talking about Daniel Jones. I think that was the beginning of really putting Daniel Jones in a really tough situation.
I'm going to agree with you, and I'm going to probably get slammed for that opinion as well. I was not a Pat Shurmur fan.
Neither was I.
And I thought, I didn't think they were going to go anyplace with him. But with that said, the whole reason why I think they hired him, and I said this back when they were interviewing
he's
head
a quarterback
coaches,
guy.
Right. That's exactly why. I kept saying, and when people said, put money on it, who do you think they're going to hire as the head coach? I said, Shurmur. He makes the most sense. Now, yes, it would have delayed the franchise going forward, but you got to figure out where your priorities are. You know what I'm saying? And, if Daniel Jones is going to be your quarterback for the next decade, isn't it more important to, I mean, look at how many years the Browns kind of threw away just to kind of build up that roster and make them competitive. It takes time. And, it took years for the roster to deteriorate. It wasn't exactly going to get turned around in 1 or 2 years.
Yeah. And that was my whole take with Shermer. Like you just said, quarterback guy, got a career year out of Nick Foles, got a career year out of Case Keenum, got a career year out of Sam Bradford. You bring him here to the New York Giants, and that is the primary reason why he got the job. And if John Mara knew that he was going to fire Shermer if they won 4 or 5 games the next year, then he shouldn't have allowed Pat Shermer to handpick the quarterback. That's my opinion on the matter. Once you allowed him to pick that quarterback, I think they should have stuck with Shermer for another year.
Yeah. And, this goes back to something that I know I've said before with this organization and where I think they've erred the most. When they swept out Tom Coughlin, as much as I love Eli, I would have swept out Coughlin, Eli, and the GM, and I would have started fresh with a new GM, new head coach, new quarterback, all coming in at the same time, because now you have piecemeal. And now it's like, okay, this guy isn't really my guy, but I'm kind of stuck with him. And, Joe Judge, to his credit so far, he's trying to make it work with Eli. But then again, Joe Judge is only in his second year. Does he have any street cred, so to speak, to go into, the ownership and say, I don't want this guy. I want my own quarterback.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a tough situation all around the way that Mara set this up. But I'm in complete agreement with you about 2015. I think we want to talk about what really put the team in the situation they're in that year. I think that year is by far the biggest primary problem when you elected to keep Reese and fire Kopp when you should have done both. And then, like you said, had you done that, you more than likely move on from Eli as well.
Yeah, definitely. But, we can't go back and change things, unfortunately. We'll have to see what happens moving forward. But let's now talk about Saquon. Now, at the time when they made the pick, I understood the pick. And from the short-term perspective, I agreed with the pick from the short-term perspective, because Eli was coming off, I think, 3 seasons where he had thrown for over 600 times, which was unheard of for a guy who was approaching 40. Okay. So my belief is the Giants took Saquon with the idea of, okay, let's give this guy a running back and another weapon so that we could take some of the pressure off of him and sometimes have him, go into that game management role. All right. Now, at the same time, Eli was approaching the end of his contract. So again, it goes back to what I was saying about, why not put offensive linemen in there? Because even Eli could have appreciated having some good offensive linemen at that stage in his career. When you look at Saquon and just how things have happened, and I know injuries aren't the guy's fault, so I'm not, trashing the guy because he's been injured. But when you look at that whole sequence from 2018 to where we are now with him, what are your thoughts on him moving forward for the future? Would you pay him big bucks?
I love Saquon Barkley. I think the guy's a class act. You obviously have more of a relationship with him than I do, but from what I see, I think the guy's a class act. I think the guy's a tremendous talent. But at the end of the day, first off, as far as the pick goes, I understood it. I prefer to trade down on draft night. If I'm being completely honest, that's what I wanted. He was the best player in the draft. You listen to any expert going into that draft, they said Barkley was the best player in the draft. The reason why it was a bad pick, as much as I love Saquon, it's because they were not in a place at that point to try to go out there and win a Super Bowl. And when you draft a running back that early, that's like the Cowboys. When they took Zeke, they already had a really good offensive line, right? And he came in there, and his first year there, I think they went 13-3. They went to the playoffs. The Giants didn't have a team like that. I felt like that offseason, Gettleman tried to do everything at once. Like, he tried to fix the offensive line and get a running back in the same offseason. The only way I justifiably would have been like, yeah, that's a really good pick, is if the offensive line was already established. He went out there, he tried to sign Nate Solder, he drafted Will Hernandez, and it didn't work. The offensive line was a disaster. As far as Barkley goes right now, he's had a lot of tough luck. Like you said, tons of injuries. That's not his fault. But at the end of the day, much like I said about Daniel Jones, it's the same thing with Barkley. If you can't win on Barkley's rookie contract, and the guy has not proven to stay healthy his last 2 or 3 years in the league, unless he's willing to come back on a cheap salary, I don't see how you could give him a second long-term extension in terms of big bucks. Now, I think he will be back next year because they gave him the $7 million extension. And is it possible if he plays really well, if they don't trade him, they could franchise tag him for a year, so it's only a 1 year commitment, similar to what the Steelers did with Le'Veon Bell. I could see something like that. Like if he plays really well next year, I could see him here for another year or two, maybe on franchise tags, but I don't see the New York Giants giving him a long-term commitment.
All right, Giant fans, we have more coming up on today's episode of the LockedOn Giants podcast. But this episode is brought to you in part by McDonald's, proudly serving communities since 1965. McDonald's has always been more than just a place to get tasty, affordable food. It's a place where friends and family can come to reconnect, recharge, relax over a diverse menu that will satisfy just about any diet, any taste. So head on out to your local McDonald's and enjoy their endless supply of French fries, their delicious shakes, their hamburgers, their chicken sandwiches, whatever you're craving, they're sure to have it. McDonald's, I'm loving it. All right, let's talk now about the defense. When they lost Dalvin Tomlinson, I don't know, maybe I'm making a big deal over it, but I thought that was a huge and underrated loss for them. We kind of saw it a little bit in the run defense, especially after Blake Martinez went down. Back last year, Dalvin was great at occupying the gaps. Blake would shoot in there and, penetrate and get the tackles and rack them up. This year, that's missing. And Am I crazy when I say that Dalvin Tomlinson, missing Dalvin Tomlinson is still a big deal?
I mean, as far as the run defense goes, you're absolutely right. I mean, even you think about even the Chiefs game where I said we came out with a great game plan. We couldn't stop their run to save our lives. Our run defense this year has not been very good. I'm not sure where it ranks, but it hasn't been good. As far as Tomlinson goes, Tomlinson was great leader. I knew going into the offseason, though, especially after they signed Logan Ryan, and I know he's a huge fan favorite, and I think Logan Ryan's a great guy. I think he's a leader of the team. I was not in love with the contract personally. Before free agency hit to commit $30 million to 3 years to Logan Ryan, I thought that money could have been better spent elsewhere, whether that be Dalvin Tomlinson, whether that be Kevin Zeitler, keeping Kevin Zeitler on the roster. Of course, you could also say the Kyle Rudolph contract probably wasn't the best of ideas either. But as far as Tomlinson goes, I knew once they signed Ryan that they weren't going to be able to keep both Leonard Williams and Dalvin Tomlinson. I knew they were going to have to pick one. And as much as I love Dalvin, I thought he was more replaceable than Leonard Williams was. But to be fair, like you said, they haven't really replaced him. Danny Shelton's been horrible. Austin Johnson's been okay, but they don't have a run stuffer in the middle. So they still haven't replaced him. But at the same time, after they signed Ryan, I understood not bringing back Tomlinson.
Yeah, and it was pretty obvious at that point, pass rusher or run stuffer, you go with the pass rusher. That was kind of a no-brainer. But
yeah.
Now they also tried to fix the pass rush. And so far, the pass rush has been disappointing. But that said, I like Ojulari. I think he's going to be a stud. I'm a little surprised that Carter and Zimenez have kind of been quiet as they have been. And I like Quincy Roche. Quincy Roche was actually one of my draft crushes.
So was me too.
Oh,
I
wow,
I actually retweeted it after we picked him up off waivers. I said on Twitter like 2 weeks before the draft, if the Giants take Roche in the third or fourth round, I won't blink an eye. I was a big fan of Roche, and I was shocked that the Steelers cut him.
Yeah, well, they tried to sneak him onto the practice squad, but the point being is I think with this duo that maybe, just maybe, because the Giants haven't had a homegrown pass rusher since JPP. And it's interesting because I had a conversation a couple of years ago with Osi Umenyiora about that. And I said, Osi, what's up with this pass rush? Why can't they get a pass rush going? He said, because basically the well dried up. He says, it's like a tree. When you have a tree and you cut off the branches and then sooner or later the tree dies off. And if you don't have, another tree coming up or branches growing, he says it kind of dies off because these guys don't understand or appreciate the Giants' tradition as pass rushers. Yeah. And I just think, to have a homegrown pass rusher, and I'm not taking anything away from Marcus Golden, who I thought was, fantastic while he was here, but he wasn't homegrown.
Right.
So now they have Ojulari, they have Quincy Roche. Even though Quincy Roche started with the Steelers, I'm going to consider him homegrown because they're going to work with him, hopefully, and keep him a while. I feel the pass rush is going to start looking up. I mean, do you agree?
Yeah, I still don't know if either one of those guys are like a high-end pass rusher. I think that remains to be seen, but I definitely think the pass rush looks a lot better than it did at the beginning of the year. And those guys should hopefully only improve as players. I'm trying to be as, I guess, like down to earth as I possibly can be with Ojulari, because I know people are really hyping him up, as they should be. He's got 5.5 sacks. But I remember in BJ Hill's rookie year, we did this. I remember in Lorenzo Carter's rookie year, we did this. So Shane Zimenez's rookie year, we did this. So I'm trying to stay even keel with Ojulari, but I've definitely been really excited with what he's done so far. And I was a big fan of him as well going into the draft. I thought he fit our scheme beautifully. So so far so good. And like you said, Roche was a big crush of mine as well. And he's played really well the last couple of weeks. So yeah, I do think the pass rush has been much better. And even when these guys get back healthy, the Carters and the Zimenezes of the world, they could come in, but I want to see these guys remain in the lineup.
I do too. And, when we speak of pass rush, just to be clear, we're not just talking sacks. We're talking moving guys off their marks and, getting the pressures and the hits, forcing early throws, forcing the offense into making mistakes. I just think we've seen more of that these last few weeks, with this particular pass rush.
For sure. Specifically Roche.
Mm-hmm.
The last couple of weeks, not just the sack that he got at the end of the game, but like you said, moving the quarterback. So yeah, he's done a really good job overall. Quincy Roche has been really good the last 2 weeks.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the back end of the defense, because this one's kind of interesting. Now I'm going to start with Dory Jackson. I thought he came in, got off to a little bit of a slow start. He's been playing better the last couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Bradbury on the other side, I'm not sure what happened from last year to this year. I don't know if maybe if they disguised some of his weaknesses or whatnot, but he's not playing like he did last year. It's, he's always had, I think, trouble with some speed and certain routes and whatnot. Just, he looks slower to me. And I don't know if he's nursing an injury or what's going on with him. But when you look at the corners, Jackson and Bradbury, are you concerned about the output that they've given us so far?
Yeah, Bradbury, and he's been okay. At the beginning of the year, he really struggled. He's been okay. He still hasn't been what he was last year. I agree with you on that. I still think it's a solid corner group for now, but what I worry about is the future. We don't have a long-term answer. Dory Jackson, I actually think, has been close to really good. Like, I think a lot of fans are kind of overlooking him because of the contract that he signed, but I think Dory Jackson's been pretty good all year. I know he had the big drop to interception earlier in the year, but Dory Jackson, I think, has been pretty good. He was really good in the Chiefs game, as was Bradbury. Did a good job against Kelsey, but long-term, I definitely have my doubts. And I will say the corners this year, well, they have been at least okay. Bradbury specifically still has not lived up to my expectations. I thought that would be a big, big strength of this defense. And while it's been probably average, it hasn't been good enough to the point where I really thought that it was going to benefit our pass rush.
Yeah. And, I would not be surprised. And I've said this before on my show. I wouldn't be surprised if Bradbury's not here next year.
I'm got with you. It saves us $13 million.
I think it's a $21 million hit, but $13 million, I think, is salary.
Yeah. $13 million. It would save us if we cut him.
Yeah, exactly. So that would not surprise me. Get a young corner. You've got 10 draft picks next year. So I'm sure the cornerback class is not that weak, but let's talk a little bit about the safeties, because, that some good and bad there. Xavier Mckinney looks like he is going to be a superstar. I mean, just really playing well.
What a friggin' game he had last week.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Oh my gosh. Jabril Peppers on IR, you hate seeing that, but you kind of got the impression that he was starting to be phased out a little bit in favor of McKinney. And then, of course, you've got Logan Ryan, who, what is he now? This is the first year of the contract.
3-year deal. Yeah.
Year. So the first year of that 3-year deal, great leader, but at what I don't know if he's going to necessarily see the end of that contract. I would be surprised. So the safeties, and it's funny because I thought that was a strength coming in, and now I don't feel that way.
Yeah, well, obviously Peppers is out for the year now, but he even before that, like you said, I remember there were games early in the year where he was only getting like 15 snaps. Like, he was getting phased out a little bit, struggled in coverage against Noah Fant the first game. He was really bad in coverage against him. I think the secondary as a whole, corners and safeties combined, I thought was going to be much better than what it's been overall so far this year. The silver lining is, like you said, McKinney's looked really good the last 3-4 weeks. So hopefully the Giants got a really good player there. I think they do. Ryan, I think he'll play next year because we can't cut him, but I don't think he'll be on the team after that. So we probably still need to bring in another safety, whether it be via the draft or free agency down the line. But Peppers and I want to get your opinion on this. And I actually watched one of your shows, I think before the year started, where you thought that Aaron Robinson potentially, even though he was drafted to be a slot corner, could take Jabril Peppers' role, which I thought was interesting because he is a very physical player. He's a little bit undersized to play safety. But as far as Peppers goes, before the year started, I thought there was no chance we were bringing him back. Like, no chance, because we had no money in terms of cap space long term. So after we backordered all the salaries, now that he's gotten hurt, as crazy as it may sound, I actually think he could be back with the Giants, because I could see Peppers next year signing a 1-year prove-it deal, similar to what like Logan Ryan did coming off the injury, and for like $4 million to play with the Giants for 1 more year. And then if he stays healthy, going out there and getting a big contract elsewhere. But I don't think Peppers or Logan Ryan are obviously going to be here for more than another year after this year.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought of, bringing Peppers back on a 1-year deal, but I guess that would make sense. I mean, if they could pull it off, they just don't have a lot of money to where they can sign guys to big contracts. So
yeah, it would have to be like a 1-year.
Yeah, it would have to be
deal.
that. There's, so, but if Peppers gets a big deal like Landon Collins got, I mean, you're not getting into a bidding war.
Now that he's had the ACL injury, right?
Yeah, I don't. Well, you never know. I mean, some team might be desperate enough to sign him. You never know. But me personally, I wouldn't mind having Peppers back. I've always liked Peppers and what he brings to the table. Judge seems to like what he brings to the table, and as that star linebacker, he's probably the best fit in terms of his size and his skill set. So I would have no problem with that for sure. All right, Giant fans, we have more coming up on today's podcast. But first, if you do a lot of driving like I do, then you need to know about a fantastic new app called Get Upside. When you open an account on Get Upside, you can save up to 25 cents per gallon every time you fill up at the pump. And for a limited time only, when you use our special promo code Touchdown, you can double that savings. That's right. You'll get 50 cents off per gallon on your first fill up when you open an account on Get Upside using our special promo code Touchdown. You can get paid out from Get Upside anytime you wish. The options include direct deposit to your bank account, PayPal, Amazon gift cards, so many more, and you are in control. So download the free Get Upside app today. Start saving. Again, that's 25 cents off per gallon every time you fill up at the pump. And with your first fill up after you sign up with an account using our promo code Touchdown, you'll save 50 cents off per gallon. All right, couple more questions. I want to ask you about 2 guys that draw a lot of, criticism from the fans and whether or not you think they should be back. And let's start with Jason Garrett.
Okay. I've been as fair as I possibly can be with Jason Garrett, I feel, at least. Maybe some people may disagree with me, but I did not use him as a punching bag like I think the entire fan base did last year. I recognized, like we talked about, how Daniel Jones had very little to work with. Well, you could say the same thing about Jason Garrett. Jason Garrett had the same offensive line. Jason Garrett had the same playmakers. Jason Garrett had Daniel Jones, who was learning a new scheme. So you had to figure that was going to take some time. So last year, I kind of gave him a little bit of a pass. I also think the conservative philosophy is more Judge-driven than Garrett-driven. I really believe that. I believe that last year. I still believe that. But as far as his scheme, it just doesn't work. And I blame it a lot more on the Giants themselves than Garrett, because the Giants should have been smart enough to realize we don't have the personnel to run a scheme like this. Jason Garrett's scheme calls for a really strong offensive line. He wants to run the air Coryell offense. He wants to take shots down the field. But in order to do that, and he wants to be able to run the ball, in order to do that, you have to be able to block. And the West Coast style offense with Shermer just fit this grouping so much better. In a perfect world, that's all I talk about. I want offensive linemen. If it was up to me, we draft 2 offensive linemen in the first round next year. We need to fix that. But we didn't have the line to get the most out of Garrett's scheme. Do I think if Garrett was with the Browns, he could have a good offense? Yeah. But I just don't think it could work here.
Yeah, I question that too, because he did have that strong offensive line. And, and it goes back to what I was saying before about the quarterback. Dak Prescott comes in, 4th round pick or whatever he was, and boom, he looks like a superstar.
Tony Romo.
Tony Romo, who was undrafted. I mean, there's something to be said about offensive linemen.
He just had Cooper Rush throw for 300
yards. Yes, exactly.
He couldn't even make the team as our 3rd string quarterback.
Exactly. All right, last guy I want to ask you about, and I saved the best for last, Dave Gettleman.
Okay. Again, I've been fair with Dave. A lot of people actually have called me a Dave Gettleman apologist.
Me too.
I am off. Now, is it all his fault? No. Have they had bad luck? Yes. There's been injuries. Does his draft look pretty good this year? Yeah, it does. If we're being fair, right? He traded down. He got a future first. He got Kadarius Toney. He traded down. He got a future third. He got Azeez Ojulari. Looked like he had a damn good draft this year. Free agency, though. And the biggest gripe I have with Dave and why I defended Dave as much as I did up until this year was that I believe in his philosophy in building from the inside out, building the offensive line, the hog mollies, as he likes to call them. And he tried, right? He signed Nate Solder. He traded for Kevin Zeitler. He drafted Will Hernandez in the early second round. He took Andrew Thomas fourth overall. He took Shane Lemieux in the fifth. He took Matt Baird in the third. So he tried. But this year is where he lost me. I'm like, okay, offensive line, addressing offensive line. He's been doing it every year. Some of it's worked out. Some of it hasn't. I wanted Rashawn Slater. Like, it was as clear as day to me that that's who they needed to take. If they did, and once they traded down, you still got to take a lineman. But that's what I wanted, especially after Zeitler left. And for him to not draft an offensive lineman in the first round, and this is after you spend as much money as you did on Kenny Golladay. You brought in John Ross. You got Saquon Barkley back. I like Tony. I like Tony a lot. But they needed to address the offensive line. They needed to continue to do that. And for him to put his faith in Shane Lemieux at a 30 PFF grade the year before, he was the worst ranked guard in all of football. And Matt Parrott, who couldn't even beat Nate Solder out in training camp this year, for him to put his faith in those two linemen, that's where I really jumped off the Dave Gettleman train. And there's been bad luck, right? Lemieux got hurt before the year started. Like, I try to be as fair as I could be. And I do think he's done some good here. I think some fans don't acknowledge that. I do think he's done some good, but he's also done some bad. And you have 4 straight losing seasons, and we'll see how this year plays out. But if you have 4 straight losing seasons, it's very hard for me to defend you as a general manager. But what I will say is, whoever replaces Dave, and some fans may hate hearing this from me, I'm going to give him a long leash, just like I did for Dave, because that guy is going to inherit just as bad of a situation as Dave Gettleman did. So I'm going to give that guy just as much of an opportunity. But yeah, after you went out there and spent in the way in which you did in free agency, and for this team to be 3-6 at this point, unless they turn around and finish, say, 9-8, maybe 8-9, it's very hard for me to say that I'd want Gettleman back.
Yeah, I'm with you with regards to where I started to fall off the train a little bit, because it just made no sense. And it just, like you said, it's almost like he went back and he adapted what Reese was doing. Reese was building from the outside in versus from the inside out. And I
really think it was somewhat judge influenced.
Maybe, but the point being is like, you're spending all this money on a wide receiver and on a tight end. What about your line? And then sit there and say, we're going to go with these guys. Okay, fine. But where was the young talent behind these guys? The retirement's not Dave's fault. I get that. Yeah. The injury's not his fault. But this is exactly, and I wrote this article on Giants Country for SI. This is exactly where Reese made the mistake, in that if you look back, the offensive line from 2007 to 2009, which was so good, they didn't start rebuilding that line really until 2013.
And then he screwed up when he did it.
Yeah. What took them so long, And with Dave, with this one, they didn't draft anybody. They did sign, Brett Heggie, who isn't even on the practice squad, if I'm not mistaken. I just don't understand it. They were going to roll with these older guys, many of whom will not be here next year. Nate Solder will not be here next year. Jonathan Harrison was supposed to be on the roster. He was on the practice squad, and now he's on IR. And I'm just trying to think who else they've got. The Wes Martin, I think they have.
Then they traded for Billy Price, who's been a disaster.
Billy Price. The point being is they don't have, to me, in my mind, they don't have young talent in the pipeline. And if you have injuries, that's going to screw you,
You look at the best teams in the NFL in terms of the way they build their teams, at least in my opinion. The New Orleans Saints draft an offensive lineman in the first round like every other year. The Dallas Cowboys always are drafted first round. Like, that's the way you should build your team. And this year, he just got away from it. And next year, we got to get back to it. We got to fix the line because, I think our line has been so bad over the last, like you said, 10 years, that this year, when the offensive line wasn't abysmal for like a game, fans were like, oh, the offensive line's fine. It's not a problem. They're playing well. No. They're they're playing mediocre, but because we're so used to saying a horrible offensive line play, we're like, all right, they played well. The offensive line is still atrocious, and it's not their fault. We have a bunch of hand-me-downs from other teams that shouldn't be starting. We have one starter on this team right now, in my opinion, and he's hurt. And that's Andrew Thomas, and hopefully he's back sooner than later.
Yeah. And, they're going to probably lose Will Hernandez in free agency. I mean, just not a good
Will,
situation.
I guess, is a borderline starter, but I've been disappointed with him as well.
He's been up and down. I mean, I've seen some good from him, some bad, but, I'm not so sure he's back next year. I love
Will.
I like Will too. I think he's great.
But
I've had him on the show. I think he's fantastic.
Yeah, I love Will
as a person.
I really thought he was going to have a really he looks. So
I did
good.
too.
He looked so good in training camp this year when he dropped the weight. And,
yep.
I don't know, and maybe it's not his fault. Maybe it's all the other bad linemen around him. I don't know.
It could be, playing next to different guys and stuff. But the offensive line's still an issue, and they promised to fix it or vowed to fix it, and it's still ongoing. And you're right. You have to keep replenishing that depth. Yeah. And they haven't really, to me, done as good a job in that. And that's going to help sink this. And what I think happens with Dave Gettleman, and I've said this before, I think at the end of the year, regardless of what happens, he's gone. Yeah. It's either going to be him retiring, and if the Giants make the playoffs, I can see them saying, okay, you know what, Dave, I've left the organization in a better place than what they were when I first came in. I'm going to go retire, watch you guys from Cape Cod. Or if they just continue to wet the bed, I mean, he's out. I mean, I'm not so sure he's back next year. I really would be surprised.
I agree with you. I think he'll have the option to come back if they win, say, 9 games, but I think he'll retire. I don't think he'll be fired if say they win 6 or 7 games. But what's your opinion on what they're going to do with the GM? Because here's my take. If they win 6 or 7 games, which is what I think they're going to do. Right now, I have them for 7 wins. I look at their remaining schedule. I think they're going to find a way to win 7 games. If they win 7 games, I think Mara's going to want Judge back. I think.
Oh, absolutely.
But here's my question, though, Pat, and this is where it gets, I guess, interesting. If he's going to bring Judge back, which I'm cool with, can you really bring in an outside general manager? Because in my opinion, when he brought Gettleman in the first time, I think he forced Eli Manning on him. I really do. Or he wouldn't have hired Dave had he not been okay with Eli Manning. So if you're going to force Judge on the next general manager, if you're hiring an outside general manager, you're kind of limiting your hiring candidates because most GMs are going to want to have to say in terms of which coach they're going to want to hire, which is what makes me believe, because I do think they're going to stick with Judge and I do think they're going to stick with Jones, which is probably not the most attractive feature for a new GM coming from the outside of the organization. I think they're going to hire in-house. I think they're going to hire either Abrams or they're going to hire O'Brien. I think the guy they got from the Lions. That's my guess.
I hope that doesn't happen. No offense to either of those gentlemen.
That's what I think is going to happen.
I could see that happening, but I hope it doesn't. Get a fresh voice in here. Again, going back to my plant theory, George Young was fantastic. Hall of Fame GM. And from him, you had Ernie Accorsi, who was just as good.
He's great.
Okay. You could say Ernie Accorsi built 2 Super Bowl rosters. I still give him credit for the 2011 roster. Even though
2007 is undeniable.
2011, a lot of that roster was still from Ernie's era.
Reese
the added
first
to
one,
it.
I have this conversation all the time on my channel. People hate me that love Jerry Reese, I guess, but I say like 97% of the credit for the first Super Bowl is Accorsi. That's undeniable.
Absolutely.
The second one is at least still 50%. At least. Like Reese definitely brought in some good players, right? He got Victor Cruz. He definitely got some good players on that team. But the quarterback is still from Accorsi. The majority of that offensive line is still from Accorsi.
Yep.
So I agree with you. I think Accorsi was at least half responsible for the second Super Bowl and pretty much fully responsible for the first one.
Yes, agree. And then from Accorsi, you got Reese, like we were saying, and then Gettleman. So it has all come from the same tree.
Yeah.
Which means to me that the thinking is now stale. I would love to see them take a chance on maybe one of these young and up and coming personnel guys.
Yeah.
And get fresh perspectives in here. You've got a young head coach who right now I don't think is in a position to dictate who they bring in as a GM if a switch is made. So why not put a young guy with another young guy see how it works. I mean, it's interesting. We talk about Dave Gettleman and the role over the last few years. I don't know if this is by design or if this is just how things went, but go back to the years of when Shermer was here.
Mm-hmm.
What did Gettleman do? What was his approach? His approach was, I'm here to get the coaches what they need.
Yeah.
All right. So that's why when James Betcher was the defensive coordinator, you saw a slew of former Cardinals coming in here.
You mentioned one earlier, Golden.
Yeah. Yes. But he worked out, but I'm saying there were a bunch that didn't.
Bethea, you go down the list.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're going to tell me that Bethea was a wiser choice than, say, Trey Boston?
Yeah. No.
I'm sorry, not buying that.
Yeah.
So my point is I'm just wondering if Dave took on the approach that, okay, you know what, coaching staff, you tell me what you need, I'm going to go get it. And is he, I at some point.
No, I agree with you. I agree. I mean, obviously, I think Gettleman had some say in terms of the decisions, sure. But yeah, people said that, like when Judge took over, I saw people in the media and fans saying that, oh, Judge is making the decisions. Look, they're bringing in guys that Judge is familiar with. They're bringing in guys that Graham is familiar with. It's the same thing he did with Shermer.
Right.
It was the same exact. Nothing changed. That's what Gettleman has always done.
Right. So that's what I'm saying is, and I'm not saying that Dave has been a puppet. Don't get me wrong here, but I'm just wondering if have there been times, and I guess we'll never know unless Dave decides to write a tell-all someday, if he ever just steps up and says, say, no, you're not getting this guy. I think this guy's better, and how much of this is on. I don't want to call that being passive because that's not the right word. I get what Dave's trying to do, but can that type of relationship sustain? I mean, the coaches and the personnel guy gets the personnel. And when you start blending the two, does it necessarily work out? And I think it's a question that the Giants need to look at if they decide to make a change at general manager.
I'm with you. Ideally, I would love an outside guy. That's what I want. I just wonder if what I worry about is this. If they are going to force Judge on the next GM, is that going to scare away candidates? Are you going to end up with a middle of the road general manager candidate because he doesn't have say in terms of who his head coach is going to be? He doesn't have say in terms of who his quarterback's going to be. So that's what I worry about. And it's why part of me is almost like, if they're going to do that, just bring in an in-house guy for a year and see if this could work. And if it doesn't work after that, just blow it up.
Or you just keep everybody and say, okay, you know what? We're going to give everybody one more year. Daniel's going to enter the fourth year of his deal. We'll see how it goes. And just, because it goes back to what we were saying before in 2015, when they had a chance to blow everything up, start fresh, and they didn't. Maybe you keep everybody a year and you just say, okay, you know what? Let's see what happens. And if this doesn't work, GM, you're out. Head coach, you're out. Yeah. Quarterback, you're out. We're starting from scratch.
And if they do that, the fan base will revolt. Like if Gettleman's back.
I know. Oh my
but it
gosh.
might be just being, if they hired Abrams or if they hired O'Brien, it's basically Gettleman just without the funny press conferences.
All right, my friend, this was fantastic. I really do appreciate the time. Tell everybody where they can find you. And folks, check him out. What a terrific guest. I was so glad we were able to make this happen.
Yeah, I appreciate you for having me on. You can find me at the Entertainah Talking Sports. Actually, I'll probably live today, talking Giants. I haven't done it in like 4 or 5 days, so I'll probably do a live stream just talking about the bye. Well, this is going to be out after that. But regardless, you can find me in the Entertainah Talking Sports. I talk Giants. I talk some New York Knicks as well. And I had an absolute blast. Anytime you want to come on my channel or you want me to come back on, just let me know. I had a great time talking to you.
Yeah, same here. I'm amazed at how your thoughts kind of mirror mine. So I'm sitting here going, wow.
We're both all about the offensive line. Fix the line.
Yes. All right, Giant fans, that is going to do it for this edition of the LockedOn Giants podcast. Want to thank you all for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day, or if you're watching us on YouTube, your first watch of the day. Make sure you leave your comments, your feedback, and check out my new friend, the Entertainah, on his channel. Great guy. And you can follow him on Twitter at the Entertainah. So for Chris, this is Patricia Traina. We're signing off. We'll catch you tomorrow.